once again to another edition of Good Books. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today is Paul Barrett. He's an assistant managing editor and senior writer at Bloomberg Business Week. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller Glock, The Rise of America's Gun, American Islam, The Struggle for the Soul of Religion, and The Good Black, A True Story of Race in America. He lives and works in New York City, and the book we're going to talk about today has a lot of interesting information in it about the history of a long legal battle. The book is The Law of the Jungle, the $19 billion battle over oil in the rainforest, and the lawyer who would stop at nothing to win. And that's absolutely true. Mr. Barrett, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is an interesting story, and it spans decades, and it's about how after plundering the oil supply without much attention to protecting the environment, there was a huge battle over cleaning up the mess.
That's right. This is a story that began really in the 1960s when Ecuador, at that time a very poor country, decided to exploit the oil riches that existed in the beneath the ground in the rainforest region known as El Oriente, the East, which is an area in the northeast part of the country, east of the Andes mountain range. And Texaco, later acquired by Chevron, answered Ecuador's invitation, signed a series of agreements with successive Ecuadorian governments, and began producing oil in that region. And the events that followed really provide the backdrop for this epic legal fight.
Mm-hmm. Now, it starts off with intrigue around the surveillance of a really obsessed lawyer by the name of Stephen Donziger, who steps out of his home on Broadway and feels like he's being followed by a couple of different cars, and sometimes sees men on foot, and just really is worried about his corporate foes.
Right. Well, this is, of course, many years later, Donziger has, in the interim, become the lead lawyer representing some 30,000 poor Ecuadorian farmers and members of indigenous tribes who live in the rainforest and are complaining that Chevron, as the acquirer of Texaco, should be held responsible for cleaning up massive oil contamination that exists in the region where they live, that has contaminated streams and rivers from which they drawn drinking water, where they had fished, left Olympic swimming pool-sized waste oil pits filled with the byproducts from drilling, and so forth. And Donziger, who is this idealistic, very passionate, very energetic New York-based lawyer, has come to represent these thousands of Ecuadorians in this huge battle, which, in an extraordinary turn, resulted in a $19 billion verdict favoring Donziger and his clients in 2011, whereby a trial court in Ecuador said that, yes, indeed, the multinational oil company was responsible for all of this ecological devastation. Now, the oil company had several answers to that accusation, which I can get into if you'd like. But meanwhile, Donziger felt that he was himself personally targeted by Chevron, its lawyers, its private investigators, and yes, was walking around New York looking over his shoulder, wondering whether the dark sedans following him contained Chevron-employed private eyes. And when I went to the oil company and asked, is that true? Were you following Donziger around? They didn't deny it. So I think it is likely that he was, at least for some period of time, being surveilled here in New York.
Let's back it up, because this has a long history, and it starts off with him kind of being disappointed with his life as a public defender, and the Ecuador oil pollution case had allowed him to become what he really wanted to be, which is a rabble-rousing human rights advocate.
Right, exactly right. Donziger was an unusual guy from very early on in his life. Directly out of college, he got a job with a wire service covering the Nicaraguan Civil War in the early 1980s. That, of course, pitted the leftist Sandinistas against the right-wing Contra militias that were supported by the U.S. Donziger sympathized with the Sandinistas, had generally a kind of skeptical, anti-American view of politics and international relations and corporate behavior. He then went on to Harvard Law School, where he was a classmate and friend of a young man named Barack Obama. Mm-hmm. And upon leaving Harvard Law School, he took a relatively conventional job as a criminal public defender in Washington. But this did not really fulfill his ambition in total. He said, in reflecting on these years, that he knew it was God's work, but it wasn't quite big enough or exciting enough for him. And then along came this pollution lawsuit, which was first filed in 1993 in New York on behalf of these poor Ecuadorians, and accused Texaco at that time of being responsible for defiling the rainforest. And this was the cause he was looking for. He spoke Spanish fluently. He was familiar with Latin America, had traveled and lived in that region, and this sense of adventure, taking on a huge multinational corporation, this was the kind of cause that he'd been looking for.
Mm-hmm. Now, this area had been exploited by other businesses, but they had gone sour. And when the petroleum industry started arriving, a lot of the natives in the area had no idea what a white man looked like at the time. Right?
Well, that would describe accurately some of the members of the indigenous tribes. There's two basic categories of people who live in this relatively remote rainforest region. One are the members of semi-nomadic, fairly isolated indigenous tribes, some of which not only don't speak English, but they don't even speak Spanish. They speak their own traditional languages. But then the larger share of the population actually were people who would have had greater exposure to the outside world. They were known as colonists. That's what Ecuadorians call them, because they had moved to the region as farmers at the behest of the Ecuadorian government. Mm-hmm. Simultaneously with the oil industry arriving in the 60s and 70s, the Ecuadorian government was encouraging poor people to move to this area to develop agriculture, raising cattle, crops, and other things. So this begins to hint at the complexity of this situation, because it actually was Ecuadorian society that encouraged many tens of thousands of people to pick up from where they lived, whether it was in the south of the country or in the highlands, and move to the jungle, where they were given free land and encouraged actually to cut down the trees and undertake agriculture. And this actually exacerbated the impact of the environmental side effects of the oil industry, because had all those people not been there, their health and livelihoods would not have been threatened, obviously. So that begins to hint at the fact that this is not as simple as a strictly David versus Goliath. It's all the oil company just sort of pillaging and wreaking havoc. That Ecuadorian society is involved here too, and we can expand on that if you'd like.
Mm-hmm. Let's do the agriculture was not just cattle, but they were growing coca and rubber.
No, coca and rubber. They're growing crops for beans and cacao and other things that they are used for foodstuffs. Mm-hmm. So no, the rubber trade had been there generations earlier and had receded. This was, farming as you'd find it, anywhere. The idea was that these were people who were not able to make a living elsewhere in the country, so they were moved to what was known at the time as empty territories. Now, these areas actually weren't empty; there were the indigenous tribes. But that was the societal plan as dictated by the government in Quito.
Mm-hmm. Now the indigenous folks suffered enormously because they just weren't used to all of this stuff, and they had probably never seen workers from helicopters landing in their area before and drilling holes and making the earth
right.
shake.
They were displaced. I mean, these were groups relatively small in size, but they were used to hunting and fishing over very large areas, and now suddenly you had industry coming in, forcing them to move around, but also more significantly, in certain areas, contaminating the water sources that were central to their lives. I mean, these were people who relied heavily on fishing, and also for their drinking water, they relied on the stream water, the river water, and they, bathed in those areas. And now a lot of those areas looked more like what perhaps the Gulf Coast of Texas or Louisiana looked like in pre-regulation days in the 40s or 50s, as the oil industry and the chemical industry was beginning to develop in those regions. Which is to say, it's a fairly dirty business, and natural resources get polluted if there's no government oversight.
Mm-hmm. Now, we mentioned the rubber industry fell by the wayside, and the indigenous people had suffered some illnesses back then, but nothing like what came along when the oil brought new and more serious afflictions to the area.
Well, there's actually this now gets you into an area where there's actually some debate over the empirical information, because certainly that is the plaintiff's contention. That is the contention of advocates on behalf of the indigenous population, that the oil industry brought all kinds of diseases with it, and that exposure to hydrocarbons actually caused cancer, and that cancer rates rose. But in fact, once this became a legal fight, and Texaco and then later Chevron had an interest in trying to disprove the connection between the oil industry and human harms, it actually is a debatable issue as to what the cause of this or that case of cancer or stomach problems or skin rashes is. I mean, certainly contaminated streams do not improve your health, mm-hmm. but on the other hand, connecting a particular oil spill with the level of health or lack of good health is a challenging thing, and that is one of the reasons why taking this kind of dispute into the legal system is not necessarily 100% the most successful approach. An alternative approach is just to have governmental forces clean up what exists, build health clinics, provide medical care, and not get into trying to establish what may have caused the health harms 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. Now, Texaco was a bit of a maverick company compared to the other oil companies that abandoned this area long before Texaco was willing to leave it behind.
It was a single-minded and distinctly aggressive company in this region. There had been other major multinationals that had explored in this area, but Texaco had some success just to the north in Colombia in discovering commercially exploitable oil, and it persisted, and as technology improved, it found that it could produce oil at a profit in the Ecuadorian portion of the rainforest. And it's crucial to emphasize that in the 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, and even today for that matter, the Ecuadorian government, Ecuadorian society, Ecuadorian business establishment, it was very enthusiastic about producing oil too. Mm-hmm. Texaco did not show up here in the dark of night, drill oil wells, pump oil out, and then leave without telling anybody. It arrived at the invitation of the government. The government ended up owning a majority of the joint consortium that Texaco operated, and the government and Ecuadorian society more broadly enjoyed the vast majority of the financial proceeds from all this activity. The majority of the oil that was being produced was owned and then sold by Ecuador. Moreover, Ecuador taxed and drew royalties from the oil that Texaco sold. I'm not suggesting that Texaco was doing this for altruistic purposes, as a charity gesture. No, Texaco was there to make money and did make money. Moreover, Texaco wanted to recognize on its books the reserves in this area, which is a big part of oil industry accounting. So everybody was there to make money, and nobody was there to look out for the environment or for the potential side effects on the people who lived in close proximity. The culpability was shared, although once it was translated into a lawsuit by the American lawyers, they wanted to focus all of the attention strictly on the oil company and actually reached an agreement with the Ecuadorian government and the Ecuadorian National Oil Company that they would not seek to hold Ecuador liable. The story they wanted to tell, the deep pocket they wanted to reach into, was that of the evil oil company that had afflicted these people. And that there was some truth to that, perhaps, but it wasn't the full story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, I was surprised to read tax rates, Texaco's earnings, the tax rates went up from 44 to 87.3% at one point, and that's quite an increase in taxes. And really, most of the money stayed there. And when they created the state oil company Ecuador,
right,
suddenly it should have been their culpability for all those unlined pits and other things, all the spills that were going on. But that seemed to be totally ignored by the legal team.
Well, that's right. Let's break that down a little bit. When once Texaco was sued in 1993 in New York, it did a couple of things. It defended the lawsuit. It also negotiated basically a separation agreement from Ecuador, where the company had been kicked out of Ecuador when the Ecuadorian government nationalized the oil industry. But they actually reached an agreement on cleaning up, or as the technical term, remediating the pollution sites. Mm-hmm. First thing to observe is that is a tacit acknowledgement that there were pollution sites to be cleaned up, that during Texaco's tenure, 2 decades, in Ecuador, a period that produced some $25 billion in oil revenue, that there were side effects, that there was pollution. Texaco negotiated an agreement with the government of Ecuador under which Texaco was responsible for cleaning up 1/3 of the pollution sites in El Oriente. The Ecuadorian government accepted responsibility for cleaning up 2/3 of those sites, and that division, 1/3, 2/3, reflected the ownership division. Texaco had owned 1/3 of the consortium. The Ecuadorian government had owned 2/3 of the consortium. Now, Texaco did a cleanup. Its antagonists have suggested it was an inadequate cleanup, but they did something. The Ecuadorian government did almost nothing and left untouched many of the pollution sites that it was, by contract, responsible for cleaning up. Making matters even worse, beginning in the early 1990s, operating responsibility shifted from Texaco, which had been kicked out, to what the company that became known as Petroecuador, the national oil company. Sadly, Petroecuador, over the years, became every bit as bad a polluter as Texaco had been, so that by the 2000s, when this lawsuit had been grinding on for some years and had shifted from New York down to a court in Ecuador, by that point, it was difficult to look back through time and sort out whose oil spill was whose. Is this contaminated area the product of Texaco's misdeeds, or is it the product of Petroecuador's misdeeds? Moreover, who had responsibility for cleaning this up back in the 1990s? Was it on the map? Was it Texaco's responsibility? Was it Petroecuador? On the fingers start to point, and a lot of ambiguity and murkiness creeps into the story.
Mm-hmm. Now, the ambiguity around the illnesses, and in fact, at some point you talk about how there was a higher rate of cancer away from the oil fields in another part of Ecuador than in the oil fields, but there's an awful lot about drilling muds that might contain corrosions, biocides, fungicides, chemical compounds.
Oh, yes.
So it is a dirty business.
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, here's what's not debatable. What's not debatable is that there was a ton of pollution, hundreds of these Olympic swimming pool-sized waste oil pits with the byproducts of the drilling process, just scattered out in a rainforest environment where it's pouring rain every day, and all this gunk is kind of moving around on the surface into nearby streams. On top of which, another example of what Texaco did incorrectly was, rather than in a responsible way dealing with the billions of gallons of so-called production water, the water that comes up when you drill oil, it just discharged that water on the surface right back into streams and rivers that people relied on for drinking water, to fish, and so forth. The problem was that Petroecuador then basically adopted these same practices mm-hmm. and continued them going forward. So there's a huge amount of pollution. However, it's then a challenging question to answer of how did that pollution particularly affect the health of the people in the region. It's not such a straightforward thing to answer. Yes, I mean, obviously streams and rivers were ruined, but can you connect that in a hard scientific sense to the level of cancer or the level of digestive problems that people have? And that's a more challenging question to answer.
Mm-hmm. Now, clearly, and you mentioned some of this, that they never fenced the pits or lined them or filled them. They were unwilling to invest what it would cost to really clean up.
That's right.
And they were willing to conceal evidence of pollution. But by the same token, the showmanship of Donziger played heavily into how the litigation played out.
Well, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the showmanship came to supersede the actual hard, nitty-gritty work of proving which oil could be connected all the way back to the 70s and 80s and to Texaco, as opposed to which oil that was on the ground was the responsibility of Petroecuador. And rather than putting together a bulletproof legal case, Donziger invested a lot more time and energy in putting together a very impressive, I must say, media and celebrity-driven kind of campaign to paint the multinational oil company as an all-purpose villain. And he was very successful at doing that, recruiting celebrities, Sting, his wife Trudy Styler, Bianca Jagger, on and on like that, getting a huge amount of very favorable media coverage, particularly in the 2000s, between 2003 and 2009, 2010. But the problem was the case he was putting together on the ground in Ecuador was not that solid. And in fact, it was so murky and inconclusive that at a crucial juncture, he actually basically pressured the trial judge using something that it really approached blackmail. The trial judge in Ecuador at that time was vulnerable to complaints about sexual harassment at the courthouse, and Donziger's people went to him and said, look, we're going to file a complaint that could end your career, or you could change the evidence-gathering procedure to the one that we prefer. And the judge went along with that. That allowed Donziger to put into place basically a corrupt, what we would call in this country a special master, a court-appointed official, and to submit to the court a ghostwritten by Donziger's people, damages report. And from that point forward, what was going on there was really the corruption of the legal case as opposed to the execution of a legitimate legal case.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the stars that got involved, Sting and his wife Trudy and Bianca Jagger and Mia Farrow and people like that. But the Kennedys got involved too at some point. Right? RFK Jr. wrote an essay on this one.
RFK Jr. was involved at the very, very outset of this whole thing. Mm-hmm. When the original research that brought to the attention of North Americans how much pollution there was in this region in Ecuador, at that point the very respectable mainstream Natural Resources Defense Council actually underwrote some of the dissemination of that information. RFK Jr. took a trip down there, added an essay to a monograph that was published. But I think it's very significant to observe that NRDC and other mainstream environmental groups backed away from this case over time. And by the time you got to the big clash in the 2000s, there were not actually organizations like NRDC backing Donziger. He was out on his own pursuing this case in a way that a group like NRDC never would. I don't think NRDC would be bribing judges or twisting their arms or submitting fabricated evidence.
Right, and this took on a life of its own because of the ego of Donziger, and we ought to bring in the picture now of the documentary makers, because that became a part of the Sundance Film Festival, and the stars were really on board with that.
He was Donziger was very skilled at attracting media attention, and at an extreme, he actually solicited the attention of a very prominent documentary filmmaker named Joe Berlinger, who followed Donziger around at Donziger's behest for years while he was working on the case in Ecuador. This produced a very celebrated documentary film called Crude, which, as you said, debuted at the Sundance Film Festival in 2009. Robert Redford was in the audience applauding. Sting and Trudy Styler were on the dais soliciting contributions for the case afterwards. So it was a big event, reviewed very favorably by the New York Times. But it came back to bite Donziger and, more importantly, his clients for a couple of reasons. Chevron decided that once it became clear that Chevron was going to lose in court in Ecuador, it decided to really do a deep investigation of Donziger. And one thing that it obtained was, via subpoena, it got all of the field tapes, the outtakes from this movie. And those began to reveal some of the shady tactics that Donziger was employing. And those outtakes encouraged a federal judge in this country to allow Chevron to subpoena all of Donziger's records, which eventually he was forced to turn over, and it was in those records that the evidence of his having ghostwritten court documents that were supposed to have been neutral and independent, evidence of money changing hands under the table, pressure tactics, and so forth, all of that began to come to light. And eventually, Chevron actually turned the tables on him and sued him for racketeering in this country. So the oil company poses as the victim. The avenging plaintiff's lawyer is turned into the defendant, and sadly, Donziger's avant-garde legal tactics, his strange way of pursuing this case, provided a lot of evidence to Chevron that allowed the oil company to shift the attention from the pollution that had happened years earlier to the conduct of the American lawyer. And eventually, March 2014, just this year, a federal judge in New York agreed with Chevron and said that this lawsuit, which may have been legitimate when it started, the judge said, evolved over time into an extortion plot. It became a racketeering conspiracy, and he held Donziger liable as a racketeer under U.S. law. And that's why right now there's a question as to whether that $19 billion verdict in Ecuador will ever be enforced.
Mm-hmm. Well, the shenanigans on both sides are interesting in this. I mean, Donziger got 60 Minutes and a lot of the media to buy off, news media to buy off on the fact that his cause was just and righteous. And you also mentioned that Chevron is pretty good at dirty tactics, too, when they need to be.
Well, Chevron certainly employed tactics that would never pass muster in this country. I mean, one of the examples that I detail in the book is the fact that Chevron's defense lawyers in Ecuador actually set up shop and were living during the trial in Ecuador in a villa that the oil company built on an Ecuadorian military base. So when they would, retreat from the courthouse every night, they wouldn't be going to an ordinary hotel. They would be going to a military base, to a facility that they had built and which they were then going to bequeath to the military. Now, in a country where the military historically wields tremendous political influence, this obviously was an arrangement that signaled or would signal to any reasonable person that the military was on Chevron's side. Now, you could never imagine a maneuver like that in the United States. That's just not the way lawyers would behave. But in Ecuador, invoking the alleged security threats to their people, Chevron was basically arm in arm with the military. Or the military, I think more accurately could say, was Chevron's host. It was sort of the hotel keeper, the innkeeper for the oil company. That kind of strangeness permeates the case on all sides.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was really, as I was reading the latter part of this, I was looking for the good guy, because, and you mentioned at one point, Donziger's misdeeds do not exonerate the oil companies or the government of Ecuador. I mean, he even tried to keep Ecuador from cleaning up because he didn't want them to clean it up too fast because they needed it to be dirty for what he was up to.
Well, that's perhaps the low point, I would say, of Donziger's performance here. While the case was being fought out in the courts in Ecuador, his people were actually lobbying the administration of the president, Rafael Correa, not to clean up these sites. He didn't want the government of Ecuador accepting tacit responsibility for the pollution because he wanted that to rest entirely with Chevron. And also, he didn't want to see the cinematic backdrop for the whole case, these horribly polluted areas erased and taken away, because that was providing a lot of the drama, or melodrama, that gave the whole campaign so much force. So yes, I would agree with you that I don't really see any heroes here. I don't think the Ecuadorian government has stepped up to deal with this in a reasonable way. I don't think the oil company took reasonable steps either in the first instance to prevent the pollution. That was the oil company's first sin. And then secondly, once this lawsuit was filed, I think that there were opportunities early in the pendency of the lawsuit, all the way back in the mid-1990s, when it might have been resolved for a reasonable amount of money, and some money could actually have been devoted to cleaning up those areas that hadn't been cleaned up, and some relief could have been directed to the people who needed relief. That is the poor residents of this area, many of whom were totally innocent bystanders, while their region, this rainforest region, was industrialized. So I don't see any heroes in this tale, but I think that's often the case when you have this kind of complicated social and economic problem. Mm-hmm. How are we going to modernize, industrialize a poor and rural area where there are natural resources? Frequently, none of the parties involved, governmental, corporate, or otherwise, behave in the heroic fashion that we would wish they did.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking with Paul Barrett about his book, Law of the Jungle. It's a very readable story about intrigue and profit and a multi-billion-dollar legal battle over the rainforest and the people who would stop at nothing to win. It's a great read. I recommend it highly. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you that if you don't hear our show the 4 times every week that it's broadcast, you can also catch us on YouTube at Good Books Radio. Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.